Okay, so we're recording. We're ready for the Esoteric Book Club meeting number. I don't know. We don't have numbers, but we're talking about Coagulation, chapter 17 of the Emerald Tablet, Alchemy for Personal Transformation by Dennis William Hauck. And we're going to start out with the astrology, just the transits that are happening at the moment. And then go into chapter 17, talk about what coagulation is, our experiences with that, and end it with the homework assignment for next week. So we'll just go right in to share a screen. And so the chart for right now is we have a stellium in Virgo, and that's all the personal planets with an opposition to Neptune. And so currently a lot of themes have been coming up around Pisces, Virgo opposition experiences. Of course, we just had our full moon, and the moon is going into a new moon soon on the 13th.
Opposite. We had our new moon going to full.
Oh, that's
We're at
where I'm
first
at.
quarter moon tonight. First quarter Sagittarius moon.
That's what I was gonna say. I'm thinking like reverse of everything right now. Yes, thank you. We're waxing into a full moon. And so these themes of Virgo purity versus godliness and cleanliness and orderliness, and then washing away it all comes into play. Virgo's the last sign of the summer months, and I know during the mutable season we're really anxious to move on to the cardinal season sign. I know I am pretty much ready for summer to be over and for fall to begin, which will be in about 17 days, actually, when the sun moves into Libra, or ingresses into Libra. So the full moon on the 13th, thank you, Annalisa, will be...
That's why I'm here.
Let's see, it'll be 21 degrees. And it is gonna be right there at 21 degrees. So it's making a pretty close conjunction with Neptune. And we're already feeling that Neptunian pull with all of these personal planets making an opposition to it. So feeling like you're in a very watery, fluid state. Dreams are kind of emerging vividly. Sleep time is becoming more of your consciousness. And what I mean by that is just being more aware of your sleeping patterns or the way that you're sleeping or dreaming. And it's a really great time to hone in on your personal practice and daily meditation routine, your daily spiritual practice, and aside from spirituality, just your daily practice in general, the way you spend your time throughout the day, what you do, what you focus your energy on, perfecting your daily routine and perfecting the way that you work in general. Kind of getting rid of any systems or processes that are just clogging up the system, anything that is just mind chatter that happens a lot. Where I know that when I was working in the corporate world, that kind of mind chatter to just like work out problems or situations happens a lot, where you're like, okay, talk about the situation, and then, but you have to do it. So kind of getting rid of a bit of that mind chatter and honing in on perfecting the skill. Yes. What else, Anna? Would you like to add anything?
I like that you're talking about the mental process a lot, because I feel like the T square that's happening with Jupiter and Neptune and Mercury, more around right now rather than this chart, it's making me feel like Mercury is in retrograde, even though it's not, just because of the way that that energy seems to manifest in the T square formation. So I feel like a lot of people right now are having a lot of internal conflicts that are manifesting in communication dynamics that they're kind of being forced to have to deal with. And then on a personal level, like technology is just really whack right now for me. And I feel like I'm just kind of like, why is this happening? And then the last time I had I had a grand square in my personal chart involving Neptune, Jupiter, Mercury, and Ceres, because I have Ceres natally in Gemini and Mercury natally in Virgo. And then I had Jupiter and Neptune transit squaring those parts of my chart. So now those squares are happening, but the Virgo energy is on that part of my chart. And a lot of the same issues I was having previously when I was having that grand square are happening again in this month. So there's kind of like this weird theme that's going on every time this square is happening. So I feel like anybody that's a mutable sign or has a lot of heavy mutable placements in their chart, in Pisces, Sag, Virgo, and Gemini, might be experiencing the themes of these planets more than other people, perhaps, just because it's directly hitting them so much. So if you're any of those signs and you're like, why is everything so hard right now, we're all feeling it, but then it's like hitting those people more directly. So that's something that I feel like that T square is really powerful right now. And then the 29 degrees with Venus and Mercury on the day of the full moon, I feel like speaks a lot to the themes around that, because the 29th degree being the aneretic degree, it's like through something really hard we're kind of being forced to end something, and the full moon is about letting things go and kind of letting yourself move into another chapter. So I feel like Venus, relationships, and how we process our experiences, especially with Mercury, like Venus is experiencing something, whereas Mercury is to know something. And so through the act of experiencing what we know, there's something that we're being forced to have to reconcile or move past or let go in some way. And I feel like that seems like it's going to be pretty important moving into the winter or the autumn, I guess the autumn months. So interesting.
Yeah, that's a really great point about Venus and Mercury being conjunct like that. And yeah, I can imagine in all the Geminis right now either being super pulled towards action, like making changes, doing something, actually putting the Martian energy into whatever it is that they want to accomplish right now. And for some people that might be really difficult, and for other people it might be really inspiring time. But for those who maybe are more on the intellectual, it might be difficult. And then for the ones who are accustomed to kind of like craftsmanship, like people who work with the land or physical objects, might feel really inspired and inclined to get out and make something, to create. But yeah, the Venus Mercury conjunction, I like how you described that with like kind of intellectualizing the relationships that we are in. And with the oppositions, of course, it's all about the dualistic nature of you and the other person. And so when the moon is opposite the sun, the moon being our, what does it say in the book? Well, Mercury is, I guess, the soul or the spirit, and then the sun is the soul. But I don't know, some astrologers equate the moon to being the soul and the sun being the ego, or the sun being the creative life force or the will. Um, but in the book, Dennis, not just Dennis, but probably just in general, esotericism gives the relationship of the of sulfur to the soul, mercury, the spirit, and salt is the physical body. But yeah, when they're in opposition, it's all about balancing them, balancing the two very strong polarities, which is Pisces energy and Virgo. And the Pisces energy, the Pisces and Virgo polar opposition, I feel like is one of the more intense ones, because they're both kind of, I don't know. Well, I'm a cardinal. I have a lot of cardinal in my chart. So mutable to me is kind of mysterious, and to begin with, I have a lot of cardinal and fixed. So to me, they're a little ambiguous, the way that they're divided. But I feel like with the Pisces Virgo versus the Gemini and Sagittarius polar opposition, that the Pisces Virgo is much more convoluted in a way where it's harder to kind of put your finger on it. And that's probably just the nature of Pisces in general. But when we think of our daily routines and daily spiritual practice, it's all about perfecting the practice in order to get to the higher connection of source in some way, which is Pisces. And then the daily practice is Virgo. So learning how to be grounded, but also able to transcend the mental realm in a way that allows you to release all sense of boundaries between yourself and other, and the earth and higher self and soul and the one source, I feel is the really strong polarity within Pisces and Virgo. I just feel that the polarity is so strong because the earth element versus the high-minded watery element of Pisces, which is so much in a desire of non-existence almost, that desire in itself is really strong within Pisces. And then also the desire for perfection is so strong within Virgo. But yeah. Well, what else? Anything else, Anna Lisa?
I mean, we're probably good with that for now.
Yeah.
I feel like that's the gist. Yeah. I mean, there's a mystic rectangle that's happening right now. Like, that's significant, I guess. But
Yeah.
we really need to talk about it that much. But it's
Yeah.
a beneficial thing in terms of us working toward, like, what's happening right now in a lot of the sphere that I'm noticing that this mystic rectangle could be attributed to. Like, we could look at it in the mundane sense of looking at what's happening in our politics, but I'm thinking more of what's happening with people I'm reading for and people in my family. But I think that Capricorn Cancer, those eclipses, right, like that we had in Capricorn Cancer, they ignite kind of like a theme for an extended period of time. And then as the years progressing, we're kind of experiencing what those eclipses were activating. And I feel like this mystic rectangle incorporating the nodes is really hitting right now, I think, with the T-square that's also in effect. And what I'm witnessing with a lot of people right now is just the need to really heal family trauma. Like, I'm having so much of that in my personal life, and then like hearing about my clients and kind of them, like there's a lot of outbursts that are happening, or people are really like going to the jugular of their pain bodies or their pain centers and like kind of wanting to hash out things that are unresolved, that are at the like base root of their being, or where they kind of formed who they were. And I think that's kind of a good segue into coagulation too, is the question of like, who am I, or like, why am I like this, or how did I get to where I am now kind of questions. And so, yeah, I feel like there's kind of like something being brought up to the surface with the mystic rectangle in that way, of like our ancestral story that we are living, and like how that's either holding us back from moving into that next phase of ourselves, or it's helping us advance into more of who we want to be, depending on that process. But I feel like those nodes, and Pluto and Saturn, and the Pisces Virgo kind of stuff, it's all creating that rectangle. And the rectangle is said, it's like through the oppositions being integrated, the rectangle's formed, and the rectangle itself is really beneficial. It's really powerful in our lives, and it helps us to grow and to expand and to kind of be in power of those areas. But it's through the integration of the oppositions that we're able to do that. And so kind of piggybacking on what you were saying earlier about the opposition of Neptune and Pisces, and just the differences that they can manifest. We think about Virgo and Pisces, and then Cancer and Capricorn, and those are the water earth signs in cardinal and mutable. So it's interesting because we're actually moving from mutable to cardinal right now, once we leave that. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know.
Yeah, it looks like September 7th is when the sun will be in kind of the exact per aspect to the angles, and then the moon will make a pass over Saturn, and then, an aspect to the nodes, and then the moon will make a pass over the Saturn and the nodes and make an exact to all of the planets within this aspect in the mystic rectangle. So September 7th will probably be when we feel a full culmination of, or a full internal manifestation of this brewing aspect. That's like, yeah, bringing out a lot. I always think of it culturally. It's easier for me to see, I think, the shifts in the cultural sense. But so, all right. Do you want to go ahead and lead us?
Yeah.
Coagulation?
Let me get my notes. So coagulation is the last, even though it's technically not the last step, it is the last step of this 7-step process, which is pretty amazing. We made it. We stuck with it. I feel like it's kind of amazing to me that we've actually read every chapter the way that we have and stuck with the spiritual alchemical journey and all the experiences that we've all had together as a group through this. It's pretty amazing because this has not been easy, I feel like. So I feel very, like when we finally read this chapter, I felt kind of like a sense of accomplishment just in the fact we all stuck with it. So, I love it. But anyways, the last operation is coagulation, in which the 7-stepped emerald formula of solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, is satisfied. Coagulation transcends both heaven and earth and produces a new incarnation that can survive in both realms. According to contemporary French alchemist Francois Trojani, the emerald formula is at work on all levels in the universe, even in the basic differences between the eastern and western hemispheres on our own planet. He explained his views in a recent interview. So solve et coagula, dissolution and condensation, emptiness and form, unmanifest and manifest, implicate and explicate or explicit. This is perhaps the most powerful dialect of all. The typical occidental one-sidedness tends to be on the coagula side of the equation, and the typical oriental one-sidedness tends to be on the solve side. The West needs a huge dose of solve, but, and this especially needs to be heard by those of the Eastern persuasion, the self also coagulates. It produces questions that cannot be solved, such as the question of questions, who am I? The infinite value of this question is in the ever-deepening asking of it and not in the solving of it. In this, which that to me, like, was, so I think, like, I had texted you when I was reading this and I was getting emotional because I think for me, in my own personal alchemical journey, that question has been really hard, especially like Pisces moon. We're talking about Pisces Virgo, like having a Pisces moon, there's kind of like a permanent existential crisis of like, why are we here? Who am I? And reading this chapter and reading the infinite value of this question is in the ever deepening asking of it and not in the solving of it. In this question, we reach the heart of alchemical philosophy, the secret which protects itself, the simultaneity, the identity of solve et coagula. In other words, only by totally embracing my mortality, my utter dissolution, can I attain immortality. The coagulation, the deep and relentless asking of the question, who am I, is not other than the solution of the question. The coagulated salt is not other than the dissolved salt. In a sense, evolution is the dynamic, intelligent harmony of solve et coagula. An ancient alchemical expression of the paradox is from the one towards the one by means of the one. And I think that one of the things after reading this chapter that was really kind of comforting for me is that the journey isn't about solving the question. It's about becoming at one with the question and being more in tune with the mystery of it, and more, I think of Venus as that, like we were talking about the Venus and Mercury conjunction, and Venus is experiencing and Mercury is knowing or learning. And I feel like we have to learn, we have to go through Mercury in order to like understand at that deeper level, but it's only through Venus that we really understand. Like we have to experience it. It's one thing to read it, it's another thing to experience it. And so I feel like the whole journey of alchemy and the whole point of going through each step is so that you arrive at the experience of what you've been preparing your mind for. And I feel like that's kind of what this quote is about. And then it also breaks down how this quote and this expression contains the basic message of the Emerald Tablet. There is only one from which all things proceed and into which all things recede. And I also find this really interesting. I don't want to get off topic, but just in terms of like the discovery and science of black holes, like I find, like, I don't know that much about that. Like you might know more about that than me, but I just am like, the way stars are born and the way that we talk about star seeds. Did you write that?
This was my one note one day.
Black
just
holes.
Black holes. Whole page is empty. I was just like mind blown. That's all I could write. Because I watched that NASA special on black holes and I was just like, this is it. Like, this is all of it. This is how it started and how it ends.
Yeah.
And it's the perfect explanation for how existence is experienced as well.
Yes. Yeah, like the fading into existence and the fading out of existence and that influx. And even breathing, like the breath alone is that experience. And like when we read the Kabbalah and we're talking about the principles, the hermetic principles and the rhythm of everything, that's like flowing in and out all the time. I feel like sound is really, like they talk about the music of the spheres and sound, as being a part of that. It's this invisible language and vibration, and the math of sound, like in the Pythagoras theory and all that kind of stuff, is all linked to that. And the fact that they can like hear sounds of stars just based off the vibrational energies that they're picking up and applying that to that is all really interesting, that the black hole is like emanating that, and that there's a sound associated with creation. Like that's all really crazy to think about. And I just feel like when there's all these mantras and sounds that all these like ancient religions, like the Hindus, were, you know, emulating in their meditations and their practices, was to get them to become closer to God and closer to the God within the self. Like that was the connection to source. It was kind of their version of the coagulation process. So I think it's cool because the Emerald Tablet is kind of more of like the Western version. Like he talks about the difference between the East and the West in that quote. And I would say the Emerald Tablet is kind of like the Western answer to that process, and kind of gives, you know, people like you and me that are being manifest in the West a framework for that, since we weren't born in the East in this lifetime. And then they kind of go into that with the galaxy of stars later. But let's see if what else did I put? So we talked about that intro quote, and then that process is the body is made spiritual and the spiritual is made corporeal, which means tangible. And so you're dissolving the body by recognizing that matter is spiritual. And I like to think about the way that they view atoms, where it's like nothing is actually solid. So we're recognizing that like reality is an illusion, because spirituality lives in the imaginal, I would say, in that way. And then the spiritual is made tangible so that we actually can recognize that it's a quantifiable thing to look at the spiritual. So the two have to be, you know, kind of transmuted into each other in order to coexist equally. And
which is a very Pisces Virgo opposition theme.
It's a perfect time to talk about it. Virgo is mutable earth, and Pisces, the sixth house, which is related to health and longevity, which is the second, that's the next chapter, just very Virgo. And then the Pisces energy is, you know, we've fully 6 months later gotten to the spiritual state where the body can be dissolved. And I'm excited to read the health and longevity part, because I feel like I am on some of other studies with that. And my mom and I had a whole conversation about the energy body and the physical body have to be in harmony with each other in order for the body to heal itself. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about after this. So I'll stop saying stuff. But just thinking of like the sixth house with Virgo as that, and then the Pisces house as that watery energy body, and those two coming together is kind of this whole chapter. Like you're learning that relationship, but in coagulation, it seems like you're actually actively, so they go into later how to dematerialize. So that's when you start doing the out of body stuff. But let's see. So from the one towards the one, by the means of the one, did you want to share your crystal Bob anecdote?
Oh yeah, crystal Bob. May he be everywhere all the time. He passed over this year. So Crystal, I live in the Mojave Desert, and I live in like right by Joshua Tree. And there's this thing called the swap meet every weekend, where just a bunch of people put a bunch of stuff out. It's like an outdoor flea market. Well, all flea markets are outdoors, but and this guy, Crystal Bob, who is about in his 80s, had created this little cave out of what's that insulation that you spray? It's like kind of styrofoamy once you put it up, once it sprays out. But he made this cave out of it that was maybe about 10 feet by 4 feet wide. And it had running water inside of it, and even had fish and like little koi fish and crystals everywhere. You'd go through this little hobbit door to get in, and Crystal Bob was the keeper of the crystal cave. And when you would walk up to go into the crystal cave, he'd say, like, you know, everyone would be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. It was such an amazing experience. And his response would always be, from you, through me, to you. And when I first heard it, I thought it was cute and it's like fun, a little like paradoxical phrase. But reading this book, I understand it so much more now, and just going through the whole, I guess, my own spiritual awakening, so to speak, it makes so much sense, because his thought process for it was that he wasn't making it, everyone else was making it, that he was not an individuated I, but a part of the larger consciousness that was working to create the crystal cave together. And he was just the conduit for that to happen. So you would come up and say, oh my God, thank you so much. You'd be like, thank you. You thank yourself. You did this. And then people would be like, huh? Oh, okay. But that was his message. And I guess being able to see it manifest firsthand in the form of a crystal cave was a gift. And I wanted to share that little special moment. But, the quote, though, on that same page, which is similar to what we were talking about with the black hole, and how you were saying that that the certain religious groups would work towards finding the godliness inside. There's the same quote on 272 that says, in alchemical language, said Trojani, it is facing up to the darkness of matter, the darkness of death, and beyond that to the darkness which is darker than dark, which is none other than my truest self, or source, which could just as well be described as boundless and infinite light. So we have little black holes in all of us.
We do, and they're special. They're so, I don't know. I feel like there's like that weight. So like when you think about the cross, right? Like the cross represents physical matter. And when you think about like being, you know, crucified on a cross, it's a representation of the burden of being in a physical body. And the resurrection is like an example of the coagulated person, where like you've learned to like let go of that physical state, you know, like that's what the resurrection is supposed to be symbolizing. But fundamentalist Christian stuff doesn't. Everything's code, right? Everything's a code. So like we get caught up on all these things, but it's like all there in code. And I feel like like that cross is like the burden that gets like carried. And then when you go within and experience the death of the self, then you're resurrected into the light of the self. That's why I will always be about light and love and darkness simultaneously. When people are like, I'm mad at light and love culture, I'm like, you can't get mad at light and love culture, in the sense that we all got to embrace the polarity or the duality of all of it, you know? So I think that one of the things that you reminded me of with Crystal Bob, when you were saying like people would just kind of look at him like weird, but you're seeing, it reminds me of the the coagulated person, like that they describe at the end of the book, where they become an authentic self that is like, maybe there's followers of that person or people will worship them. But I think that aside from that, the coagulated person, like we could look at it as people who have been worshipped, but I think it's more that, like, I'm not trying to like negate Dennis Hauck or whatever, but I'm just saying I think it's deeper than, like, the coagulated person is deeper than just the people that end up on the pedestal. It's the people like Crystal Bob that are just like in with, you know, like everywhere at one, and they're constantly resurrecting any chance for their ego to be on a pedestal. It's constantly like being redirected into, we're all connected, we're all part of everything. And I feel like your story for me is good because I think that like we're always striving for that. And then he talks about the pre-coagulated person as the person that's still looking for that divinity. So they come off as arrogant and judgmental and kind of closed off, which I very much am still in that place. Like I'm definitely not a coagulated person by any means. Like I feel like I am definitely the pre-coagulated person. But people like Crystal Bob are the ones that are like reminding us of that influx. And I love that. Like I love just the thought of like the coagulated person doesn't need to be worshipped. There is no sense of the self in that way because everything has been dematerialized out of that state, and that exchange is more of what you're living in, and that's like the Ram Dass stuff. But yeah, I love Crystal Bob. Thank you, Crystal Bob, for your wisdom. He's here right now.
He's everywhere, all over.
He lives within us all. Okay, so let's see what else is on here on the agenda for tonight. So we just talked about what was on the next thing, but I'll read what I wrote. Facing death of the self on the physical plane in turn leads to immortality on the spiritual plane. Making peace and direct connection with Source dissolves the shackles or illusion of the physical world and all suffering related to the physical world. We no longer perceive ourselves as separate as we see the constant influx of energy transmuting in and out of itself from form to formless. And then I should have said, and back again to form. Facing the process of this darkness is the discovery of the Philosopher's Stone. So that's kind of the whole point of the alchemical journey. And then they talk about the tarot cards that are associated with that. So if you want to read that part or talk about that part, I can hold up the tarot cards. But he talks about the devil and the Hierophant.
Which interestingly, before I even got to that, was like that card popped into my head, and then the next paragraph was the devil. But he explains the devil. The way it makes me understand it is because the devil is like the karmic, the struggle of karma, where you feel you're trapped in the hamster wheel continuously and never endlessly being stuck in an addiction of some sort of the physical self and the mundane reality. And then the Hierophant, because the Hierophant is representative of the divinity and self. And so you have to have both in order to have all of the whole, or understand, I guess, the divine marriage between heaven and hell. And that there really is no separation because they both work off of each other. That also is another like Virgo Pisces theme that popped into my head too, was this concept of the Hierophant being, I guess he was representing it as heaven and then the devil as hell. And that when you marry them both together, that it creates a divine androgyny, or the stone. And the divine androgyny is what we're striving for, which is to go to live beyond duality, or the binary even, and to be able to see it as a whole and how it works together and merges together, and it's a balance between both. And that when you live in one only, you can't see the other fully. But when you live in both realms, you can see how they work and play off of each other, which I think is in some Christian philosophy when it comes to the devil, that God created the devil in order to create this balance between the two of them, or the worlds, that like in order to like the devil kind of has to exist in order for God to exist, because without the devil as being a counterpart, then there's really no polarity, there's no drive, there's no like passion, or I guess, how oppositions work to create friction within the self to accomplish something, or to take action on something, if that all makes sense.
Yeah. And then you get to the sun. Another tarot card of coagulation is the sun, which symbolizes the projection and multiplication powers of the stone. And then judgment depicts the final achievement. Also, the world card shows a return to earth to embody these higher insights. So the sun has kind of the androgynous child, and the child is kind of like a higher evolution of the fool in some ways, but more matured. It's like you're more still in the self, I guess. And then judgment, which is one of my favorite cards. And then the world card. And the interesting thing about the world and the devil is the world is a Saturn card and the devil is Capricorn. So they kind of have an evolution of each other, of themselves too, in that way.
Oh yeah. And then the liberated feminine, or the liberated internal self.
Yeah.
In the world portion. When I read that about the world card, I was kind of sad, to be honest.
Why? Tell us.
Because I don't, and I guess that's what the concept of dharma is, right? To go beyond the karma of this life cycle, or the devil and judgment, and to go into to exceed or strive to not be incarnated here again.
That's my goal. Kuan Yin, I'm coming.
Yeah, and so I don't know, when I just read about the world card, I was just like, no. It shows our return to earth, and to embody the higher insights. Like, no.
It's so frustrating. My mom likes to poke fun at me whenever I talk about it. She's like, well, unfortunately, you have a family that you're going to have to come have unfinished business with. And I'm like, why would you say that to me?
So rude.
I'm like, I'm trying to get out of this loop. So funny. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the most traumatic but also healing, like, channeling experiences I've had was being told that I chose to come here. And when that was told to me, I felt like all of my anger and resentment towards being incarnated here in the first place kind of was like, it melted away. And I was given like a vision of me making that contract, and the like pre-embodied stage when I was just like an ethereal energy form. And then I was like, oh, I do remember that now. Okay, I did choose to come here. And then I was like, damn it, why did I do that? And I asked, like, they told me why I did. And it feels really annoying, because it's like, you don't remember until you do. And then you're just kind of like, okay, like, I just have this weird feeling that when I die, I'm going to return somewhere, and this is all going to feel like a really weird dream and a really weird joke. And it's weird to constantly live life with that feeling that like a Truman Show feeling. Like I feel like it's the Truman Show.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Especially when you get deja vu a lot in a row. And then you think, and you're working off of that awareness level of, oh, okay, so I created this. This is happening, and I'm going to create it again. It's like when you hear little voices in your head, that's you. Like every time you hear a little voice in your head, that's some parallel aspect of yourself.
It's
And
crazy.
yeah. And if that's not Truman Show-esque, then like, I don't know what is. But just remember that next time you ever hear voices or you hear like something, a small whisper in your voice or something in your head, like that's you. That's you talking to yourself from an alternate dimension, which is pre-incarnation. And that's crazy.
Like I was told that I'm somewhere else simultaneously right now. And it's just like I feel really annoyed by that insight. And then I had this dream recently in relation to just weird parallel universe stuff. I had a dream where there was a girl in the dream that had a really specific haircut that I was hanging out with, and look, like her ethnicity was very specific and her haircut that she had was very specific. And she was driving in this convertible that this guy that I dated had, and she was driving me to go meet up with my husband, and it was my birthday. And she was like, isn't this weird that I'm driving the same car that you were in 10 years ago, the night that you and your husband got together? Like, isn't it weird that I have this car and we're hanging out? And I was like, yeah, that is really weird. And she was like my friend in the dream, but I don't know her in real life. And then I woke up from the dream and like proceeded with my day. And within like the first few hours of me being out in the world, 2 women that looked exactly like this girl from my dream were on both sides of the street at the exact same time as I was, with the same haircut, the same ethnicity. And I was just like, what is this? Like, I was like, what is life? Like, I was so weirded out. And I just was like, I can't even deal with this right now. Like, I don't even know. I don't get it. Like, I was just like kind of looking at the universe like, I don't know what this symbolizes at all, but like, okay, it was so bizarre. But yeah, like stuff like that, like glitches in the matrix or like dreams manifesting into reality and that kind of stuff. Like, I don't know what to do with that, you know?
Well, Thoth is a trickster. Mercury is a trickster.
That's true.
So it was probably a fun joke.
I like that interpretation because it makes me feel a little more like I can take it. I can take it. I love it. Anyway, so yeah, the sun, judgment, the world. The world says that our return to Earth to embody these higher insights in the 8th stage, the next step after coagulation, when we return to where we started. Dun, dun, dun. And then he talks about other alchemical images, the soaring eagle, the winged Mercury, the balanced scales of justice, or wingless creatures borne away by winged creatures. And then he goes into the phoenix and how that's the primary symbol for coagulation. Did you want to talk about that a little bit with the Phoenicians?
Yeah, I just checked up on them a little bit to give some sort of understanding to who they were. It was a culture of people who lived from 2500 BC to 539 BC, and they're thought to have created one of the first written languages, and that's what is thought that the Emerald Tablet was written in, was Phoenician during that time. And the location of it back then is now modern day northern Israel and southern Syria. and Lebanon. So that whole area in general just has so much like rich history to it. And it is a really special location, and I can see why. So the word Phoenicia is an ancient Greek term used to refer to the major export of the region that they had during the time was cloth dyed. It's called Tyrian purple or Tyrian purple, which is like a reddish purple, and they made it out of mollusk shells. So they were the biggest exporter of purple, essentially, because it was a really rare color to find back then. And the alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet was mostly used. They started it in 1050 BC. So a long, long time ago. But yeah, that's what they believe that the Emerald Tablet was originally written in. Yep.
Super cool.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So then he talks about his coagulation experience during the 7 steps of transformation and the grand meditation that is shared later in the chapter. And he talks about what it was like for him to have his out-of-body experiences, or his out-of-body experience that he had, where he was kind of in between sleep and consciousness. And I found this chapter kind of cool because I've never had an out-of-body experience. I've had lucid dreaming that was very realistic, and I've had times where I thought I was awake and I was sleeping, but I was still very much in my body. I didn't have, it would be like one of those things where would have been asleep but fully conscious, and then when I actually woke up, I was like, oh, I was actually asleep because of the way that I was resting. Like I could tell. But I've never had an actual out-of-body experience. But when I was like 2 years ago, I was reading a couple books about them, and I got really inspired to try to start doing meditations around out-of-body experiences. And I would feel this like falling, when you feel like you're falling when you're about to fall asleep, that starts to happen. And then you also can feel this, it feels like your limbs are falling asleep, but they're not. It's like this weird vibrational field starts to happen around your arms and your hands and your feet. And you can feel kind of like your hand will be laying flat, but you'll feel the ethereal hand start to like come up out of the physical hand. And then you can feel it kind of when it meets back up with the physical. And he talks about that in the book, which was fun for me because I haven't been doing any of that stuff for a long time. Because to be honest, like I have total fear around leaving I'm really afraid I won't come back. But I feel like that astral cord that he says you see and you talk about, I always forget about the cord. They talk about in all the books that you're like connected by the golden cord or the astral cord. And I forget about that part. I forget that like there's this illuminated cord that like helps you go back to your body. I always have this fear that I'm going to like be whiplashed out of my body and can't find my way back. But I thought it was cool that he talks about not being aware that he was out of his body, but having that whole sequence with the door locked and then finding his golden cord kind of back to his body. And I felt like it made me feel a little bit more comfortable about attempting the grand meditation, if that makes sense. But the topic of discussion I had for that was, how did the author's experience of coagulation resonate for you? And have you had any out-of-body experiences, or have you ever seen your astral cord or experienced an astral cord? And, what is your interpretation of that for you?
I tried leaving my body a few times through meditation, and I've never been able to fully do it. I've been able to feel get to the point where you're feeling the tingling and the lightness, but when it comes to me, for some reason, when I try to look, like they say to turn around and look at yourself, I can't do that. And I don't know, like I'm too stuck in my visual space or something. Like I have too much of a connection to it maybe. But I remember when I was younger in high school, because I used to read these books. I think it's by their Lois Duncan books, if I'm remembering correctly. She wrote these series. She's the one that wrote I Know What You Did Last Summer, but I didn't know she actually wrote that. I'd read all of her other books that were all paranormal based experiences. Like the girl was always the main character, and she would have some sort of crazy paranormal experience. And one of them was this girl who was able to astral project. So it's like, oh, I want to astral project. I want to find how to do that. And I used to try. And one time when I was laying in bed, my doorknob had a lock on it that you just turn. And I remember staring at it and being like, okay, I'm going to lock the door, lock the door, lock the door. And I just did that for maybe 10 minutes straight. And then I didn't see anything happen. It didn't turn. I was like, whatever, it didn't work. And then I just went to sleep. And then the next morning, I opened the door, walked out, went into the kitchen, and my mom was like, did you lock your door this morning? I was like, no. Why? She was like, because I tried to open the door and it wouldn't open. I was like, whoa, because I just opened the door before I walked out of the room.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So I don't know what that was, but something happened.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Amazing.
So I don't know. Those are my experiences. I have friends, like close friends, and my dad had an out of body experience where it seems very obvious.
Yeah. My mom's
Like,
had one out of body experience, and hers too. It's like obvious.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's no denying it. But so nothing crazy and like that extreme for me.
The book that I had that I was reading, there's this author who's a mystic that he's like a white guy shaman that was like a professor at Berkeley. He studied anthropology and shamanism, and him and his wife have a lot of books on death and out of body experiences and stuff. And he wrote this book called Spirit Walker that I never finished. I read his other book with his wife that was more about death, but his Spirit Walker book I never finished. But it basically is his story on his journey and how all this stuff started for him. And when I was reading about his out of body experiences, it was so wild because they started happening to him spontaneously. Like he wasn't trying to have them. And he just started going to bed at night and waking up out of his body and seeing himself. And the whole like beginning of, I mean, the whole book's about that, but I've spent so much time hearing that stuff when I was younger that I think I did so much work to encapsulate myself and like keep myself tied to my physical state, no matter how much my soul and my spirit has that Piscean need to escape it. There's like that equal fear of like dying too soon and not, being like, wait, I wasn't ready yet or something. I don't know. Like I have this weird relationship to it that I'm just like, it freaks me out, the idea of being in that state. Like I still have way too much egoic fear around it for some reason. So I think that he talks about that where he says like something about Yeah, so he says, the problem was that whenever I felt I was outside my body in meditation, the slight contamination I carried with me from my ego consciousness immediately panicked and pulled me back inside. I spent many years deliberately trying to eliminate this knee-jerk ego reaction before succeeding quite by accident. And that accidental thing, and reading Hank Wesselman's book about the spontaneous part, feels kind of like the magic ingredient in terms of the out-of-body experiences. And I know in like my channeling sessions, when I've been meditating, the analogy that I repeat over and over and over again that was given to me was the Chinese finger trap, where it's like the more you try, the tighter and the harder it is, and the more you let go and you surrender, the more likely it is to happen. But the surrendering, which I see as the Ten of Swords in the tarot, which I'll find that card really quick because I think it's a good like visual aid for how I view the death of the ego. Not just because the death card's a little more there's something about the ego of the death card itself that I don't quite always feel like speaks as highly as the Ten of Swords, because I feel like people really love the death card in a archetypal way. Like, we love the idea of death because it represents some kind of darkness, but then when we're actually experiencing death, where it doesn't feel that way. It feels more like the Ten of Swords, where it sucks, like it hurts, and we're kind of on our asses. Like, people fear the Ten of Swords. So I feel like the Ten of Swords is a more accurate depiction of the way that, of course, it was the last card. I had to go through every single card. But it's surrendering. It's defeat. It's like we've given up. We've kind of like outdone all of our tools that we thought we had to hold on, and we can do nothing but just let go. And it's kind of forced upon us in a way. I feel like this is kind of the state that you have to get to in order to have the out-of-body experience. It's like you've done all the work, you've exhausted your knowledge base, and so you know on an intellectual level what needs to happen, and you've been doing the work, you've been trying, and then it's in that like frequency of that pocket of mysticism and magic where you're not trying and you're completely letting go without even being cognizant of it. Because if you were cognizant of it, the ego would be there, which would prevent it from happening, that it can happen. So it's like this weird thing that you have to, it's just that sweet spot. And they talk about, there's this book I have on meditation where they talk about the goal of meditation is only experienced usually when the bell rings. So like you'll have the whole meditation and you're like spending the whole time trying to get out of your head, and you'll be frustrated, or you'll be like thinking about the goal, and then the bell rings, and it's in that sweet little pocket of release from your mind when the bell rings that you've actually hit the goal of meditation. And I love that so much. And I think it's kind of the same thing with the grand meditation for coagulation, is like getting rid of that
Is there a word for that?
That ringing thing, like that state.
Just
it's
the moment.
Yeah. It is. There, let me see if I can find it really quick. There totally is. It starts with an N. It's not nirvana though. I'm gonna have to find the page that it's on, but it's this book called The Breakthrough that I found in a free pile. It's Buddhist meditation as a means of liberation. And like all books, I don't think I finished this. I think I just got it and read some of it, and then
I'm going to read something from the last part of what we're talking about with coming back to Earth. As Hermes has repeatedly warned us, the 8th stage is a step off the ladder of transformation, and a return to where we started. Its inherent strength is perfected, we are told, if it is turned into earth. The successful coagulation is only made real if it descends again to earth and enters into the processes of projection and multiplication to perfect others. It is the return of Buddha, Mohammed, Christ, and all the saints. In this view, we are truly the salt of the earth. And so it must come back down, even when it goes out. But the sweet spot where the magic happens, like that's something I've actually been trying to figure out a term to use, because it's kind of like that thing, if you can pathologize it or put a word to it, then it becomes real. And then you could probably manifest it a little bit more easier.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to find this in time, but this
That's
book,
fine.
it's pretty awesome in relation to what we're talking about, though, because, this is it, I think.
Well, it's fine if you can't find it. We'll
I think
just...
it's Nibbana. So anybody watching or anybody wants to, they can Google that and see if that, it's Nibbana. Oh, it's when the heart is free from clinging, attachment, identification, the quality of defined existence, when all that's let go of. This is synonymous with the experience of Nibbana, of peacefulness, of complete freedom and clarity. And so it's the reality of non-grasping, when the heart is free of grasping, even those subtle kinds of the feelings of being, the feeling of I and me and mine, free of the quality of bhava. And this is the experience of nibbana, perfect peacefulness, the true and radical quality of the contended ease. So yeah, if you have been meditating for a few years, you will have noticed how often the most peaceful and delightful moment of the meditation is when the bell rings. And it's not just because of the relief for your knees. So it's good to investigate this delight. Pay attention to the state the mind enters when the bell rings. In addition to relief from pain, there is a moment of release because the mind is not now doing anything. Even though all we were previously doing was meditating, which is built around being peaceful and as a wholesome activity, there is still the quality of doingness, the presence of me doing a thing. That's the quality of bhava, a quality of grasping and of identification. Ding, suddenly the mind completely lets go. There's nothing more to do. It can stop. And that's nibbana. So I think that's that sweet spot.
The sweet spot.
The sweet spot where you've obtained the peace, but it's only in that brief moment.
So that was when I went to bed. I was like, lock the door, lock the door, lock the door. It was probably right when I was like, fuck it, it's not gonna happen. And then something happened.
Yeah, and your like ethereal body went and did something. It created some like vortex of vibration that prevented your mom from getting in. I also thought it was interesting that you mentioned it was a door, because his experience had to do with locked doors.
Yeah, that's what reminded me of mine. Yeah.
So that's interesting. My mom also had a lot of weird lucid experiences with somebody knocking on a door. And she's got a whole story with that I won't go into. And then I had an experience, one of my first, I don't know if it was a first, but one of my early memories and most predominant memories of lucid dreaming, where I thought I was awake, but I wasn't, was also a door. And there was a fire in the house and somebody banging on the door. And I like woke up panicking because I thought there was a fire, but there wasn't. Doors, I think, are a pretty big theme in terms of representing like the realms, the other realms to other consciousness, I think, in that way. Cool. What else here? Alchemy of fire and water, thought with feeling, the unification of sulfur, mercury, and salt manifest as So they go into the projection of the stone and how sulfur, mercury, and salt are related to that. Is that something you want to read about? I feel like you like talking about that. I don't know why.
I guess I like talking about it because I'm trying to figure it out, trying to like integrate it into my consciousness. I guess so. Sulfur is the soul, mercury is the spirit, salt is the physical body. And by balancing the soul and the spirit, which can be considered the masculine and the feminine, or the yin and the yang of the self, then you can, I guess what you're saying is manifest healing within the physical body, the physical space that those two reside in. And yeah. Also, what he says is that the imagination and the will must co-create in the work together. And that's kind of what the grand meditation aims to help accomplish. That the imagination is the spirit and the will is the soul. So we have all these words to describe these two polar oppositions that reside within the self. You know, soul, spirit, sulfur, mercury, masculine, feminine, yin, yang, dark, light, imagination, will. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And I think at this point in our reading, we've totally understood and get the fact that we need to balance these two parts of ourselves out. That the ego, I don't know, would you consider the ego as the soul in this context with the sulfur, mercury, and salt?
Yeah, I guess so.
Because the three trifecta, you know, the ego, id, and superego are similar the way that I see it psychologically as, well, the body isn't represented, but it could be like, you know, the spirit body.
I guess the way we could see it is like your body that left and did whatever weird thing to the door is spirit, but then the cognizant is the soul, which would be the ego, because we're like conscious of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? But then we were talking about the duality of the self and how there's like another dimension of self that is that other voice. So there's us, but then there's like, what's this other us? So I can see them saying like the soul is the us that we're in control of, maybe, because that's the will. That's where we're like actively, I feel like this is my soul purpose. So I'm actively making these decisions based off of what I feel in my soul.
It should be like the masculine side of you.
Yeah, the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Inherent, and then the mercury is the spirit, so that's like your higher self that's maybe connected to the subconscious. It's underneath operating, so it's not quite as obvious, even though it's still an equal part. It's more hidden until you've
Mm-hmm.
gone there.
You know what I think is crazy, by the way, is that some people don't believe in a soul. Like,
Yeah,
that's insane.
I don't know. What do they believe in then? Like, I think everybody like that's like that sees us like robots.
Yeah, that's kind of scary
Yeah.
and bizarre. And then I try to think of it that way too, because I'm like, well, what can you get from thinking about humans in this way? And I try to go there because I'm very empathetic.
Yeah.
I'm like, what does this feel like to think that way? And it scares me.
I wonder, I feel like people that are, and you know, maybe we'll get some comments on YouTube. This would be a great, like, if you're watching this, comment what you think on YouTube.
Is there a soul? Do you believe in a
I
soul?
wonder, like, people that are saying that stuff, I'm going to say something very controversial. I think you're full of shit, and I think that you are being a part of a groupthink conversation that is about your political identity, not actually rooted in what you feel or experience in reality. Because I think if you were actually a robot telling me that, I might believe you, but I feel like as a human being that's connected to you, and you know, like we think of Crystal Bob, like we're all reflections of each other. I know that even though we're different and we're mentally processing through our own filters, I know that you're having a soul experience on this planet. Like there's no way that you're human and you're not experiencing some kind of internal pressure to exist here. And where does that come from? Like besides our animal need for survival on that level, we've surpassed the animal basic, like we're not a bird that just comes in with this imprint and just eat the bird that gets the worm that does the thing in the nest and then die. Like we don't have that. We're not functioning with the natural cycle from that place. We've surpassed that. We're now trying to be gods of our world. And that's different. So where does that come from? When did that get woken up? Why did that happen? And who are we? Why are we here? And the fact that we're able to ask that question at all, and that we want to answer it at all, whether it's through science or spirituality or religion, like it doesn't really matter what the mask is. We're all having some experience of wanting to know that or being confused about it. So I feel like the people that are saying they don't have a soul are just saying stuff. Like they're intellectualizing everything and living very in a surface level state because it's too scary to ask these questions and have to actually sit with what it feels like to ask those questions, which is what people that are doing the 7 steps of alchemy are doing. And we all are feeling the pain on behalf of everybody else of asking the question. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I know that my friends that are not asking those questions, that are saying shit like this, are on plenty of antidepressants. You know what I mean? Like, not saying that like you can't be on antidepressants and still ask these questions, but I'm just saying like they're trying to like not ask the question. Like they're trying to deny it and kind of just follow, you know, like pseudoscience and rationalize away their, you know, existential pain. But I feel like, no, we're all feeling existential pain. Like we're all feeling it. We're all connected to it. And there's a soul that lives in that. Like, that's how I feel.
Mm-hmm. So that would be like a non-disillusioned self person. Like someone who hasn't gone through disillusionment or is negating that. I feel like if you don't even believe in a soul, then you can't even come to terms with a spirit then.
Yeah.
Because for the most part, people who even believe in a soul can't even come to terms with the fact that there's another part of us that exists inside. So for that fact, I don't know, I always just think about that. And I don't ever want to get into an existential debate about it with someone because I'm too tired to do that. Like I don't want to or feel the need to in any way, I guess at this point. Just like I just can't imagine thinking that way or wanting to think that way.
I guess I would be interested though, like I would be super open to hearing what somebody's thought process was coming from that place, because I think another thing that happens is that people will put identity politics on certain words, but they'll have a different word that means the same thing.
Right.
So like they might
totally.
Yeah, like they might not say soul or spirit, but they might say, like for me, like saying the word God is something that's hard for me because of the connotation of God with certain religions that I don't necessarily want to fall into when I'm in a conversation. So it's more neutral to me to say like source energy or consciousness, because I feel like that is more true to how I perceive God, even though I see God as that. You know, but like for my identity politics of the superficial sense, it's like I want to see more neutral. So I'll say source energy or I'll say consciousness, but we know at the root God is that, you know, like that's what perceiving God to be. And so I feel like somebody that says, I don't believe in a soul, might perceive soul in a religious context that isn't in line with how they're
Right.
that. And maybe they do believe in soul, but it means that there's like a different word.
You're totally right. I've actually gotten into a discussion with someone about something similar, which was like, do you believe in a higher power? And they said no. And then but then I was like, well, then do you believe that there's some sort of a connection between things in any way? It's like, and it turns out, yes, they did believe there was a higher power, but yeah, exactly to what you were saying, they didn't want to have any sort of attachments to the cultural, political, or societal connotations to the term higher power, which but that's exactly what what is it? The last, not fermented, but the one before that, I'm still trying to remember all these. Distillation? Is it the non-distilled person? Where that's where the cultural, like where you wash away the cultural, political, and societal connotations to your thought process and kind of dissolve any of those higher personifications, because disillusion was the dissolution of the ego and the self with the ego. And then I feel like distillation was the part where you work beyond the psychological structures that had been ingrained.
Yeah, and it's interesting looking at this too. It's Virgo and Libra that represent that. So it's interesting that we fell into this conversation. You know what I mean? Like in the Virgo, we're revisiting that process in this conversation.
Do you want to go to the last part, where the last page where he talks about the astrological connections?
Yeah, that sounds great. I like our tangents, though. I do have to say, it feels like there's a rhyme and a reason when we do it. Every YouTube video needs a tangent.
What is a soul? Do you believe in a soul?
And then comment below and let us know what you think.
But I guess, isn't that the point though? That's what we really want to talk about, right? Because for some of these things, we need to overcome some of these connections that we have to these words, like God that he uses, soul that he uses, even to like masculine and feminine. Okay, for example, in this chapter, very, very chapter, he says, he refers to God as a man. And so I even had to cross that out and was like, no.
Yeah.
So I still even have cultural and political and societal connections to these words myself.
It's hard not to right now.
Reacting to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I think too that we're just going to have to rewrite a lot of this stuff.
I feel really inspired to do that. I actually had an insight today that made me feel like asking who am I? Like, why am I here? I was like, oh, I actually wanted to share this with you. I'm doing it on the video. It's probably not needing to be, but I was thinking oh, we need people to write about what's happening now, the way that the Gnostics wrote and hid the stuff for people thousands of years from now to be like, what the hell was going on during this middle period where all this shit was changing. And I felt really inspired to want to start just documenting for a personal way of what it's like right now, and somehow taking all of these things we're learning and putting it in the context of the times that we're in now and how that's evolving. And then, just starting now. And then when I'm 70, printing it out and putting it in a time capsule and burying it somewhere, hoping somebody will get it when it matters or something.
We're going to need it.
Maybe that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to rewrite these outdated things that still have a lot of wisdom in them, but then like they were evolving, and like we are evolving, and here's how, but we're like in this weird middle period.
Right? Like, wouldn't you not say him for God if you were talking about transcending polarity?
Yeah.
So what the hell, Dennis?
Well, because I think that's like the way that our literary school teaches you is to like automatically use masculine pronouns when you're referring to an like just something like that was something that you know what I mean? Like you just automatically used a masculine pronoun a lot of times and referring to something kind of autonomous. And it wasn't ever questioned. But then like a lot of authors that wrote in the 70s that have had new books out have actually gone back and corrected all of that stuff in their modern print to include binary or non-binary language.
It's offensive, by the way, to anyone
I
who's
know.
a writer.
It is.
Watches.
God's a woman. I'm just kidding. That was a joke.
Yeah.
That was a joke.
I mean, that's what Ariana Grande says. Okay, so the astrological connections, and then we'll just talk about the homework and then be done because it's almost 9:00.
Yeah.
Oh, were you waiting for me?
Yeah, I thought you were going to do it. I can do it, though. I thought you were all ready. So the signs that are associated with coagulation are the Gemini twins. What does he call them? He says the divine twins of Gemini represent the alchemical rebus, whose melding of opposites was also closely associated with Hermes. And then he also says the quest of the Gemini person is for endless variety. These born under this air sign are said to be full of life, mentally agile and responsive, versatile, and enjoy expressing themselves, but they live primarily in the mind, and their free-flowing mercurial personality can bother some people. Isn't that the truth? Just kidding. And then he also says the introspective, dreamy Pisces person embodies the qualities of mind associated with projection, and the sign of Pisces denoted this part of the coagulation process. The Egyptians were using 2 fish to denote Pisces before 2300 BCE and probably associated them with the interplay of cosmic and earthly forces that meet in the primal sea. Pisceans are said to have a constant awareness of cosmic forces that humbles them and keeps their egos in check. And according to Kathleen Burr in her book, Archetypes of the Zodiac, the search for the Piscean is for the castle of peace. Kind and gentle, almost to a fault, Pisceans are seen by others as self-sacrificing and empathetic individuals. And then the next one is Aquarius, which I really enjoy the fact that this is part of the progression, just since we're entering the Aquarian age, and he talks about that. It stood for the phase of coagulation known as multiplication, in which the stone multiplies itself and its powers. With the new millennium, it is expected the entire planet will enter the cosmic age of Aquarius as hermetic truths become self-evident. And again, according to astrologer Burt, the search of the Aquarian is for the Holy Grail. The individual Aquarian is marked by uniqueness, inventiveness, unconventionality, and vision, though they can have strong dislikes and stubborn opinions. They also seek to be appreciated and enjoy popularity and sensual gratification. And he says, Age of Aquarius is that integration of mind and body is possible. The ability of the alchemist to direct the energies of his body consciously blesses him with the great healing powers. Like Belinus, the alchemist can direct this living energy to heal others or apply it to his own body. This principle is the basis for stories about alchemists who lived for hundreds of years. And one of the things to add to that has been kind of on my mind, because I've also been reading off and on. They kind of made me angry, so I had to stop, but then I recently picked it back up again, is the Nag Hammadi scriptures. And they talk about, there was something that I read that was basically kind of making me think about the Piscean age. We had Christianity, and like Christianity is associated with the Piscean age and Jesus, and it was said that after the Piscean age, we would no longer need the infrastructure of the church to teach us of our own divinity, and that in the Aquarian age, we would be waking up to that without the need for Jesus, essentially. Like Jesus was the messenger that came to establish the order that was needed to wake people up to their own divinity. And then the Piscean age ends, the Aquarius age starts, and then there's no need for that religious structure because people will just, the consciousness would have evolved to the point where people will inherently just know that. And I found that really fascinating in the sense that since Jesus, there hasn't ever been any Messiah to affect the world on that massive of a scale that we've all, as a consciousness, agreed to just believe in and worship all over the world. Like, who since Jesus has made an impact on the world in the consciousness of religion since then? Nobody.
Well, Muhammad.
Yeah, that's true, I guess. The Muslims came after that.
But other than that, it's been just a lot of saints and deities revolved around Judeo-Christian themes. I mean, but that's a very Western-centric ideology and belief. We're not aware of, maybe in the Eastern religions, something. But didn't Buddha also come around the same time as Jesus?
He was before Jesus, but
he was before.
Yeah, I don't think it was that much further, though, because supposedly Jesus went and studied Buddhism in India. Like, that was his story. But the thing that's weird to me about Jesus's story is it's essentially the same story as Buddha. Like, they share a lot of similarities. I mean, they're different stories, but there's a lot of similarities to the way those stories were told. And we don't need to get into too much of what I think because it doesn't matter. But it's very interesting to me, like, the influence of Christianity on the world over the last 2,000 years and how there's like this skepticism and this demise within society towards that rather than, and who knows, we don't know yet, but it's like we haven't seen the birth of a person being worshipped to that extent globally for a really long time. And I feel like the Aquarian age is supposedly because we're moving towards not doing that. Like, we don't need that. Like, we need to just start living in equality and for humanitarian purposes, just because it's the right thing to do, not because we want somebody to.
The only other way I see it is with divas right now. Like, people worship divas and musical acts, musical artists. That's the last, I think, time I've seen it, like Michael Jackson and Beyonce. Like, you could go to the furthest reaches of the world and someone will know Michael Jackson's name.
Yeah.
That to me is on the same level as Jesus worship, to be honest.
Yeah, I had that insight too, like with pop stars.
And that's very Piscean as well, which is worshiping musicians. Pisces is music, or worshiping any kind of movie or movie theme or movie story or some sort of a story that comes out in a movie form or picture. We're really kind of stuck in the like worshiping the image, the reflection, which is like the shadow side of Pisces. And so we're probably just seeing the shadow side of Pisces before I move into Aquarius fully.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I like that perception.
Yeah, but there's also been such a strong hold on human consciousness and evolution. Like, it's been stifled consciously and on purpose for the easier way to control large groups of people which I think is the Aquarian awareness that that we're coming to, is the amount of control that the collective consciousness has been under by authoritarian regimes or people who just want to create slaves for themselves, which is like the Pisces Virgo opposition. So like, in a very not friendly way of saying it, Virgo could be related to the slave, the person, because the sixth house is the worker or someone you employ to work for you. But then, of course, the shadow side of that is treating someone as if they're lesser because they do the lesser work, which is very Virgo. But like lesser, of course, there's no such thing as lesser work because it's all equal. But, you know, someone with an egoic mind frame would see the Virgo archetype as being like slave-like. And so I think that is a shadow side of that polarity that we're still like disrupting too, because of the fact that we still have like hundreds of thousands of people who are in indentured slaves essentially to a higher authoritarian regime, whether or not we want to think that, whether or not you want to believe it, but it's true. And I mean, slavery ended like less than 100 years ago in America and still continues to this day in other parts of the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in our country because of the like short time of, I don't even know what word to use, but just like, I don't necessarily want to say freedom per se, but there's like this sweet spot we've kind of built up to, I would say, after World War II, that kind of is like the result of where we're at now. And it's like we're in this little squishy bubble, just even with all the horrible things going on in our country, it's still like this little squishy bubble in terms of our ability to communicate about things you and I are talking about on these devices that were probably created by slaves in other countries. It's like
right.
We wear and these things like are like and for me, I kind of feel like I live in this weird catch-22 with it, where I'm like, well, because I'm here in this country in this time, I need to utilize my ability to study things that in the past I wouldn't have been able to study as a woman, as somebody who's mixed race. Like there's so many things I feel like I just want to take advantage of, knowing that what it took to get to a place where myself can do this freely. And then there's that other part that feels very like, you know, that inequality in that Aquarius way feels so wrong. Like the scales aren't even, and everything like for me, if the American empire crumbles, I'm probably gonna like, yes, I'll be in distress, but I'll be like, well, that like the pendulum always has to swing some way, you know, like the empire crumbled, you know?
Well, I mean,
I'm like, well, we don't have it coming, you know?
yeah.
It's good while it lasted, I guess. Like,
right. That's like they have this subconscious need to hoard books.
Yeah.
So just like waiting for the inevitable.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, I'm gonna need that book for when there's no internet because I'm gonna need it for reference.
When everything goes to shit.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay. So
Aquarian age.
Tangent diverted or reverted. Yeah. So the homework assignment for next week is to do the grand meditation that is explained in chapter 17, now that we've gone over chapter 17, and that and the email will be sent out for the last chapter along with this chapter, so everyone can get caught up, even though we all know that it's on YouTube now, so you can just go ahead and go to the YouTube page and listen there and get updates if you subscribe. So but for those that don't, we'll send out the email and with the last one and this one. And then the homework for the next meetup, we'll go over chapter 18 and 19. So we're going to start plowing through this book now that we've gone through the 7 steps and taken our time with that. Now the rest is just like intellectual babble.
I can't believe we just read the 7 steps.
Yeah. I think we did a pretty good job for never having read this before. And
being kind of like noobs to alchemy. I feel like I understand. I feel like if I had just read this book on my own, which is what I started out doing, not in the context of this, none of this stuff would have resonated for me as consciously. Like, sure, maybe it would have been working under the surface, but I feel like, and since we started doing this, I've been so much more aware, like, oh, I'm experiencing this alchemical process, and it allows me to like compartmentalize it in a healthier way than if I was experiencing it without this understanding.
Totally. And I think that's the whole point of using your imagination in conjunction with the will to create your reality and experience, and to bring it back down into earth, and then to do whatever you will with the knowledge from now on. So, yes. So the next chapter is about dissolving the elements. So we get more into the elements and what those mean. We get to hear more about, the pineal gland.
Ooh.
The Tao of light, ambrosia. Some really fun terms to go over. Crystal child. Second body. There's a lot going on in chapter 18. The grand elixir. Physiological alchemy. Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff. And then chapter 19 is titled Message of the Caduceus. So we'll be learning about that, which I love, the Caduceus. Yeah. Working with the lead of the Caduceus, working with the tin. So then we get into the tin, the lead, and the iron.
Finally.
Mercury. Silver. Okay, the metals. All right, well, this is a long one, I think, but a good one because we went off topic a lot.
It's some controversial topics of discussion that I hope stimulated some feelings or thoughts for people to think about, comment about.
Yeah. If you got triggered, let us know why.
It's all part of the alchemical journey. Getting triggered and dissecting where that's what I'm working through right now. My triggers. Right here.
All right. Well, we'll see y'all in 2 weeks. And we'll talk then. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.